Smart people can be very foolish, and very simple people can be very wise, because wisdom isn't about just knowing lots of things. It's about knowing and seeing the world from God's perspective. As the Proverbs say, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And so real wisdom doesn't come from knowing lots of information. It comes from knowing God and seeing the world the way he calls us to see it, and applying his calling in our life in the way he wants us to apply it. Having said that, tonight is going to be a night full of knowledge. And so I'll hand over to you, Malcolm.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. So one of the things that I thought we should do before we jump into Solomon is look at where we're getting this from, because we didn't do this when we started talking about the part of David that's covered in Kings. So I wanted to look at the books of Kings and Chronicles and what they are like. Kings is despite being two books in our Bibles, is originally one book, and it's one book in the Hebrew Bible, and Chronicles is the same. Both Kings and Chronicles are built on these historical annals that they refer to, which are records from the kingdom or something like that. We don't have these anymore, so we don't know exactly what they have in them. And Kings, unlike Chronicles, continues what we call the Deuteronomic history, and that's the narrative from Joshua through to the end of Kings, and that is addressing issues that Deuteronomy raises. That's why it's called that. Kings is anonymous. We don't know who the author was. The Jews attributed it to Jeremiah because it ends with the release of Jehoiakim from prison in Babylon. And so maybe it was Jeremiah, but we don't know. It's a really good story to read because the characters are so vivid. It's got all these twists and turns, and it really includes all of the flaws of the characters as well as their strengths. So it's a very dramatic read. And it follows both the northern and southern kingdoms after the division. So it addresses all of Israel. So it's got a lot of drama, a lot of blood. So Solomon starts with Solomon, following directly on from 2 Samuel. So that's why I didn't introduce it before, because it has the end of David, but it's also covered in 2 Samuel, and it ends with in the middle of the exile. And there's this really strong chronological background that runs through the book, how many years the kings reigned, when they started their reign, etc., etc. But it's not as simple as it sounds, because if you add those numbers up, they don't actually match. And it's probably because of at least two things. One is how they counted the number of years that kings reigned. It's different between the north and the south. The south probably took it from Egypt, which has one method, and the north probably took it from Assyria, that has a different method. Plus there's potential overlap between kings, which means that if you count how many years this king reigned and how many years that king reigned and added them together, you get it wrong, because they actually overlap a bit. So co-regency, they call that. So it's concerned about chronology, but that doesn't make it simple and straightforward. But it's clearly interested in historical fact. And the purpose of Kings is to answer the question that the Jews were asking in the middle of the exile: is God still in control? Has God ever been in control? Or is this just all, just happenstance? And so Kings answers that very definitely. God is in control, but we are rebels. And that's why we're here, because God's in control. Chronicles, on the other hand, it covers the same period, but it also covers much more. It's actually the last book in the Hebrew Bible, and I was interested to find that its Greek name means the things omitted or left over, which is paralipomenon. So it's like the leftovers, and so it's never had as much attention as perhaps it deserves. Of course, in Hebrew, its name is the first few words of the book, as always. And it actually covers from Adam, the first man, all the way up to the post-exilic period, the Cyrus's, what was it? The Cyrus's decree. The decree of Cyrus, yeah. It covers from Adam up to Saul, mostly by genealogies. So if you read Chronicles, if you try to read Chronicles, you're immediately dumped into this very elaborate list of people, and it goes into great detail about the tribes of Israel and their descendants and stuff. It's written during the Persian or Second Temple period, so that's the period that it goes up to, and that's 539 to 330 BC. Sometime in that period, it was definitely written, probably earlier. And it's obsessed with the temple, and it pays a lot of attention to Levites. So maybe a Levite was an author. Maybe the author was a Levite, given how obsessed it is with that stuff. And it contains 3 broad sections: the genealogies, the first section. Then it talks about the United Kingdom, and then it talks about the divided kingdom. And as we'll see, it talks about them quite differently to the way that Kings does, because it's answering a different question. The people of Judah are now back in the land, so they're more confident that God is in control, but they're not confident about whether they are still in God's good books. Are we still God's people, is their question. And so Chronicles is trying to answer that question. So it approaches things differently, and I'll tell you how they're different as we go along. So Solomon is David's son. This family tree of Solomon is quite complicated, partly David's fault because he had so many kids. The red people are women, the blue people are guys, are men. But Solomon made it complicated as well because he had so many wives, and doesn't even show the kids that he had from most of those wives. So the kids here are Rehoboam, who is his heir, and Graham will talk about him next week. So there's, Solomon's family tree is very complicated, like David's, and like David, Solomon doesn't have any family problems during his life, but his family doesn't go as smoothly as he might want it to be. And it's worth, I think, noting that our upbringing has an unavoidable influence on how we approach life. And Solomon himself knows this because he wrote about this in Proverbs. And I think you can see the impact of his father's behaviour on Solomon as well. I don't think I'm reading too much into that. So how does Solomon become king? Well, this is the first place where we see the King's account and the Chronicles account differ. So I'll just quickly read through these 2 accounts and we can see how they differ. In Kings, it says, then Nathan, the prophet, went to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and asked her, haven't you heard that Haggith's son Adonijah, who was the heir, he was the oldest son of David, has made himself king, and our Lord David doesn't even know about it. If you want to save your own life and the life of your son Solomon, follow my advice. Go at once to King David and say to him, my lord the king, didn't you make a vow and say to me, your son Solomon will surely be the next king and will sit on my throne? Why then has Adonijah become king? And while you're still talking with him, I will come in and confirm everything you've said. And all of that happens as Nathan has mapped out. And then Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, and the king's bodyguard took Solomon down to Gihon spring, with Solomon riding on King David's own mule. There Zadok the priest took the flask of olive oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon with the oil. Then they sounded the ram's horn, and all the people shouted, long live King Solomon! And all the people followed Solomon into Jerusalem, playing flutes and shouting for joy. The celebration was so joyous and noisy that the earth shook with the sound.
But David was still alive.
David was still alive.
I think it's one.
Well, 3 really, because Adonijah had crowned himself as king. So it's pretty messy. And Adonijah steps down. He recognises that he's not going to survive. So he just submits. We'll see what happens to him in a moment. And David dies soon after this. David sort of his hand was forced. You can, according to Kings, David's hand was sort of forced by events. He was, just before this, it talks about how he's old and weary and he just is waited on by some lithesome young woman who keeps him warm in his bed. That's literally what it says. And so it makes it sound messy and political and almost like sort of Game of Thrones in sort of. Whereas Chronicles, let's read Chronicles. Yeah, in Chronicles, this is actually David. This is a quote from David giving a speech to the people of Israel. So David's a king who's in control, who's up there giving a speech, a royal address. And he's saying, yet the Lord, the God of Israel, has chosen me from among all my father's family to be king over Israel forever. But he has chosen the tribe of Judah to rule, and from among the families of Judah, he chose my father's family. And from among my father's sons, the Lord was pleased to make me king over all Israel. And from among my sons, for the Lord has given me many, he chose Solomon to succeed me on the throne of Israel and to rule over the Lord's kingdom. He said to me, your son Solomon will build my temple and its courtyards, for I have chosen him as my son, and I will be his father. And if he continues to obey my commands and regulations as he does now, I will make his kingdom last forever. So now, with God as our witness and in the sight of all Israel, the Lord's assembly, I give you this charge. Be careful to obey all the commands of the Lord your God, so that you may continue to possess this good land and leave it to your children as a permanent inheritance. So this is a very different portrayal of Solomon's accession. It's smooth, it's God ordained, David's very much in command, and the reign's just handed over to Solomon. In fact, Chronicles hasn't even mentioned David's dalliance or David's sin with Bathsheba. It hasn't mentioned Absalom's rebellion. It doesn't mention Adonijah's rebellion here. None of that stuff happens in Chronicles. It's not interested in that. It just wants to show how God has given Israel this birthright for the land. And it's not, Chronicles isn't lying about this. It's just looking at a very particular perspective. And that's consistent throughout Chronicles. Chronicles doesn't even cover the Northern Kingdom at all. So
Chronicles, when the Solomon becomes king.
when David hands it over, like at the end of this speech, basically. Yeah. So David's basically, this is David's last address to the people, and he hands the kingship over to Chronicles. So quite different perspectives, but you can see how, you know, with Nathan's involvement in the king's account, God was there. Nathan was a prophet, so you could see if Nathan was working, you know, with the Holy Spirit, then God's involved in that. So and David had planned for Solomon to be the king after him, and so David usually does things in consultation with God. So, you know, you can see that Chronicles is not making this stuff up. It's just that Kings is emphasizing the humanity, and Chronicles is emphasizing God's plan, sort of thing. So what does Solomon do once he becomes king? Well, in Kings, this is a list from Kings. David, one of the things that David said to Solomon was to kill several people once David was dead. And so Solomon does that. He doesn't do it. He sort of does it partly reluctantly. So he doesn't kill Adonijah until he asks to marry David's concubine, which is obviously a way of claiming the throne. And so his life is forfeit and he gets killed. Abiathar the priest also does something that's treacherous, so he gets killed, and Joab is killed as well. And David wanted all of those dead. And then Shimei, who cursed David when Absalom rebelled, and David ran away from Jerusalem. Solomon gives Shimei a chance. He says, "Stay in Jerusalem and you'll survive, you'll live." But Shimei doesn't take Solomon seriously, and when his goats run off, he chases after them, and so he gets executed. Bit of a mistake there. And Kings then, after this list, Kings says, "So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon." There's no more sort of uncertainty. Solomon then goes on to make a marriage alliance via Pharaoh's daughter. So he marries Pharaoh's daughter to make an alliance with Egypt. And it talks about how Solomon was in the habit of making these huge sacrifices, 1,000 animals at a time, to God at Gibeon, which is where the tabernacle was at the time. And during one of those, at the end of one of those sacrifices, he was staying overnight and he had a dream, and God said, "Ask me for whatever you want." This painting is a painting of Solomon and God. And Solomon asked God for wisdom, and God was pleased with that. So, and he gave it to him. So let's see what Solomon was actually asking. So the text, if we look at the text here, we can see that what Solomon says is, "Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom, so God replied, "Because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you asked for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, such as no one else has had or ever will have." Now I want to zoom in on some of these words, literally. So where it says at the top here, it says Solomon had asked for wisdom. Because you've asked for wisdom, the Hebrew text doesn't actually contain the word wisdom there. It says, "Because you've asked this," God replied. So the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked this. So God replied, "Because you've asked for this in governing my people." So wisdom isn't mentioned until down the bottom. So let's go back up to the top here. Understanding. So Solomon says he wants an understanding heart. What's that mean? What's the word understanding? Well, here's what the word understanding is. It's the Greek word shema. Has anyone heard the word shema before?
Yeah.
Yeah. The shema is the word in the Shema, what the Israelites call the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. And love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind. So this word means hear or listen. So Solomon is asking for a hearing, a listening heart. And you can see that this word, that ark on the right side there, is where this word occurs in the Old Testament. And I've pulled out the wisdom books, the yellow and blue and grey ones at the top there. And you can see that it's not really a wisdom word. It's actually Jeremiah and Isaiah and Deuteronomy are bigger, and Psalms, they're more into this word, which is not surprising because of the nature of those books. But what about heart? We go down to heart here. Heart, which also means mind in the Hebrew language. So this is lev, and it's the core of your being. That's what it means, the core of your being. So a hearing heart is that you are a person who is inherently open to God's word. That's basically what it means. And we can see, if we look in the occurrence of that, you can see there in Proverbs, it's a very common word. The heart is a real concern of Proverbs. The state of somebody's heart is very important in the wisdom literature and in Ecclesiastes as well. It talks about the heart a lot. Obviously, Psalms talks about the heart a lot, but Psalms is a lot bigger than Proverbs, and it only has the same number, approximately the same number. So Proverbs talks about the heart a lot more than Psalms does. So the heart is this core of our being, the thing that controls us, really. That's an important thing for wisdom. And so that's why Solomon is asking for a listening heart, because that would make him wise. Then the next word that we're interested in is know or understanding. It's translated both ways in this passage. And that means to be discerning. So we can look at it here and we can see the big blue part of the circle down the bottom it's translated as understands, and then the red section around to the right is discerning. And you can see there's lots of other ways: perceiving, observing, looking, etc., etc. So this is about perceiving, understanding, seeing something. So this is an important word in the wisdom literature as well. You can see Job uses it a lot, the sort of grey colour that's pulled out there. Proverbs uses it heaps. And Daniel uses it a lot too, interestingly. Daniel's apocalyptic literature, not wisdom literature, but it's concerned with discerning things as well. So discernment is very important as well in wisdom. And finally, the word wise. This is the main Hebrew word for wise. And it's interesting that it's not until the end of the passage that this word pops up. Solomon doesn't literally ask for this, but God gives it to him. And this word is related to skill. So it's really about skillful living skillfully. And so it's something you can learn. It's something that is, it's what we think of as a skill. So that's why Proverbs is so useful, because you can learn it. Proverbs wouldn't be very useful if you couldn't learn it. It would just be frustrating. And you can see there in that arc, Proverbs is pulled out, but it's such a big chunk that you can hardly see that it's called out. Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job together have maybe half of the occurrences of this word in the Old Testament. So this is really the key word for explaining wisdom, and it's the skill of living. So that's what wisdom is about from a Hebrew perspective. So this is what Solomon was asking for. He was asking to have this hearing heart, this heart that's open to God, so that he could express this skill of living and discerning what's good and evil. And God gives it to him. And it allows him to do lots of things. Wisdom is an incredibly flexible, powerful tool. It helps you live well in all areas of life. It doesn't just relate to one particular area of life, it relates to them all. So it gives him judicial wisdom, and that's the first story. This picture here, you probably recognize that story. Over here is a baby, a live baby, soon not to be live. That's a sword that this guy's holding. Because these two women came to Solomon with this live baby and they said, we both had sons born at the same time, and during the night, one of us rolled on our son, and in the morning there was only one live son. And so they were both saying that the live son is their son. And so Solomon said, okay, cut the baby in two and you can have a half each. And the mother, the real mother, said, no, let the other woman have it. And so Solomon said, she's the real mother. And that was showing his judicial wisdom. It's a very cool story. He also showed administrative wisdom. There's the whole story of the building of the temple, of the building projects, of his administration of the kingdom, emphasizes how wise he was in actually managing things. And of course, he showed wisdom in managing money as well. And so Solomon is famous for being incredibly wealthy. And there are lots of things that are called Solomon's something or other because they're about gold or wealth. So 2 Chronicles says of Solomon, it took Solomon 20 years to build the Lord's temple and his own royal palace. It only took him 7 years to build the temple, by the way. So it was obviously 13 plus years to build his palace, which was much bigger and more impressive than the temple. At the end of that time, Solomon turned his attention to rebuilding the towns that King Hiram had given him, and he settled Israelites in them. Solomon also fought against the town of Hamath-Soba and conquered it. So he was wise in what the ways of battle as well. He rebuilt Tadmor in the wilderness and built towns in the region of Hamath's supply centers. He fortified the towns of Upper Beth-horon and Lower Beth-horon, rebuilding their walls and installing barred gates. He also rebuilt Baalath and other supply centers and constructed towns where his chariots and his horses could be stationed. He built everything he desired in Jerusalem and Lebanon and throughout his entire realm. And the Book of Kings also talks about what other places that Solomon built as well. So just a reminder, we saw this last week. This is the extent of Solomon's kingdom. And you can see Saul's kingdom here in the purple, David's kingdom in the green, and Solomon's kingdom extends up here. And this is his sphere of influence. Hiram, the king of Tyre, was sort of like a client king of Solomon. So it was a huge kingdom. This is way up into, see, here's Aleppo up here. So it's like way outside the realms of modern Israel and even the realms of the ancient, where Joshua's, boundaries of Israel. Solomon was very powerful. And he reigned in peace. So he actually had very powerful control. And you can see even down here, he's got a port on the Red Sea. So he had a port on the Red Sea and ports on the Mediterranean as well, and he controlled the trade routes from Africa and from the east, so from China and India and stuff. So very powerful position. That's how he got all his gold and stuff. This is an example of his building works in Jerusalem. So this little part here is the city of David. This is the part of Jerusalem that David constructed and built his palace. And Solomon built the temple up here. This is Solomon's palace. And this area was Solomon's extension of Jerusalem. This part here, by the way, is the Temple Mount, the current Temple Mount, which follows the plan of Herod's temple. So we'll see a picture of Herod's temple in a moment, but that gives you an idea of scale. And modern Jerusalem is obviously a lot bigger than all of this. This is a picture of a 6-chambered gate in Giza. There are 3 of these gates that look exactly like this, one in Giza, one in Megiddo, and one in Hazor. And in 1 Kings 9, it talks about how Solomon fortified these cities. And you can see this city, you can see in the picture there's overlooking a valley, and there's a trade route down there. So all of these cities were cities used to control the trade routes and to make sure that Jerusalem had control of the Levant, this Middle Eastern area. And there's good evidence dating these to Solomon's time. So they verify Solomon's power and wealth to a fairly significant extent. This is another diagram of Solomon's building projects. So just zoom in. All these red things here are places where Solomon built stuff, and the text sort of tells you where things came in relating to the temple, I think, and relating to other notable constructions. But you can see he did lots of building, including that port down at Ezion-Geber. So he was an incredible builder. In Israel, probably Herod was the next person who had buildings on that sort of scale. This is Solomon's temple. Now, Solomon's temple was, for its time, very impressive. It's a similar construction to other temples of the time. So archaeology has uncovered a number of temples that are quite similar, but smaller and a little bit different. They don't have, for example, the design with the Holy of Holies back here, which matches the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. So the design of Solomon's temple is very much an enlargement and a sort of permanent iteration of the tabernacle. Even the forecourt with the altar in front of the temple, the 2 pillars, and the what's now become a sea. It used to be just a laver of water. Now it's a sea of water, and there's all these extra lavers and stuff. So they can do like 1,000 sacrifices a day without becoming too crowded or too overwhelmed. And like the tabernacle, the Solomon's temple contained a lot of art that represented the idea of Eden. So that was the last time that man and God dwelt together. And so that's what this temple represents, just like the tabernacle. And it's interesting when you look at Kings and Chronicles, Kings talks about Solomon building the temple, collecting the materials, etc., whereas Chronicles credits David with doing the design and collecting the materials, and Solomon comes along and builds it. So there's again a different emphasis there. For both books, the temple is a very important achievement. For its fortunes are important in Kings, but for Chronicles, it's really very central. It's the central representation of God's covenant, and so it takes on very significant proportions in the Chronicles account. I just wanted to show you what the Solomon's temple looked like compared to Herod's temple. Herod's temple is just a stunning facility, just a massive building, and this is just a part of the whole complex. This is just the middle of the complex. So the Temple Mount is much larger. There's huge courtyards all around Herod's temple, the court of the Gentiles, and all of these porticos. But you can see that Herod's temple, the temple itself, dwarfs Solomon's temple. Yep.
It's interesting. I realized this yesterday. It's got a chamber for the lepers.
With over here, yeah, because the lepers had to come and be cleansed when they were healed.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this once you enlarge it like this, you can specify, you can have specific places like the chamber for the Nazarites, because Nazarite vows were another function that needed to be performed at the temple.
So where was Solomon's temple in compared to the Herod's temple?
Basically on top. So Solomon's temple was here, where Herod's temple is.
Built over top.
Yeah, there's a debate about whether. So the second temple was reconstructed directly on top of the Solomon's temple.
And is that the temple in the New Testament? Jesus went into the temple, or is that?
So the second temple was rebuilt out of Solomon's temple, and then Herod took the second temple and built this massive, monstrous construction, monstrous in terms of size.
Always found this terminology confusing. Was Jeremiah, was it rebuilt?
No, that was Nehemiah.
Nehemiah.
Yep, Nehemiah. Yep.
So why do they call Herod's temple the second temple? Well, let's say they expansion of the second temple.
Yeah.
Why call it the third temple?
I don't know. I think it's a continuation of the second temple. Yeah, there's not a discontinuity. Whereas with the first temple, it was the Babylonians raised it, so there weren't stones left standing on each other like after Herod's temple was destroyed, but the location was still there, the grounds were still there, and so they could build on the foundations of Solomon's temple. But the second temple was just a construction. It's debated how much of a reno it was versus a knockdown and rebuild, but it was continuously in use. There was no break.
So the temple here, built by Solomon, and it got destroyed 400 years later when the Babylonians had completely destroyed it. And then there was no temple for 100 years or so. And then the Jews returned from Babylon to Israel, to Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the temple.
Nehemiah and Ezra.
Nehemiah and Ezra. And the temple they rebuilt was really small compared to Solomon's temple.
Yeah, it was it was quite pitiful.
And then that temple stayed around. And then King Herod, the Herod who killed all the boys when Jesus was born, before Jesus was born, he was obviously a very powerful king too. He expanded the temple that Nehemiah and Ezra had rebuilt, made it big, but made it bigger and better than Solomon had. And then that got destroyed. Rome sacked Jerusalem around 70 AD, and there's been no temple since.
But the Temple Mount is still the courts that were there when Herod built it to some extent. And there's, the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall and stuff are actually the original wall of Herod's temple's courts and stuff. So there is still some remnant of Herod's temple complex that's still visible in Jerusalem to this day. So, sorry, what was that, Kerry?
I was just saying, it would be incredible to actually see it.
Yeah, it would have been amazing to be there. Actually, the season 5 of The Chosen does a pretty good job of recreating the temple during the Passover when Jesus died. So that's something that's worth watching. We just watched a couple episodes on the weekend. So Jesus was actually standing up here up here, I think, at one stage. And you could see the temple behind him in the background and stuff. So, so when the temple was commissioned, when it was completed and it was being dedicated, Solomon, that's a picture of Solomon dedicating the temple with all the Levites behind him there. Solomon gives this amazing speech, quite long. This is just a little snippet of it. And he says, "But will God really live on earth? Why, even the highest heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built. Nevertheless, listen to my prayer and my plea, O Lord my God. Hear the cry and the prayer that your servant is making to you today. May you watch over this temple night and day, this place where you have said, my name will be there. May you always hear the prayers I make towards this place. May you hear the humble and earnest requests from me and your people Israel when we pray toward this place. Yes, hear us from heaven where you live, and when you hear, forgive." So Solomon shows a sort of humility there, which is very fetching and appropriate. And in Chronicles, it actually says that once the temple had been dedicated, fire came down from God to burn all of the offerings that they had. So the temple was, it replaced the tabernacle and became the place of worship for Yahweh.
Did this happen with the tabernacle too?
Yes, that's right. So it was repeating it. Yeah, that's why Chronicles emphasizes that, I think. So this is an example of a piece of clay with a receipt for some gold from Ophir on it, just in case you're wondering if there's archaeological evidence for all this wealth that Solomon has. Yes, there is. And here is a receipt of this gold of Ophir. And Solomon was known all around the world for his wisdom. This is the Queen of Sheba coming to learn about him. And she was so impressed that it took her breath away, according to Chronicles. And he had great wisdom and understanding. He composed some 3,000 proverbs and wrote 1,005 songs. He could speak with authority about all kinds of plants. He could speak about animals, birds, small creatures and fish. And kings from every nation sent their ambassadors to listen to the wisdom of Solomon. So let's look at some of that wisdom. Now, the book of Proverbs is an anthology of wisdom, right? This is what we think of when we think of Solomon, is Proverbs. And the majority of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon, but not all of it. So because of that, dating's uncertain. Like Psalms, it's probably spread out a bit. Proverbs chapters 1 to 9 are different from the rest of the book. They're longer in form, and they're talking about wisdom as a woman. They're personifying wisdom and talking about how the young man should seek wisdom. And the first part of that, Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 to 7, are an introduction to the whole book. Very brief introduction, which ends in verse 7 with the words that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so Proverbs are very importantly, it's very important to have the fear of the Lord in order to understand Proverbs. So you've got to, your relationship with God is foundational to wisdom. Proverbs contrasts wisdom and folly. It doesn't just talk about wisdom, it contrasts it with folly. and it covers religious and practical views. In fact, in many ways, it fuses the two. So Solomon's Proverbs run from chapter 10 to chapter 22, verse 16, and then pick up again in chapter 25 to 29, and it tells you in the text. And it's a randomly ordered collection of what are called bicolar aphorisms. Bicolar means two parts, and aphorism is just a wise saying. That's a common word that you can now take away and use in your everyday life. And all the ways, an example of this are, all the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. So there's two parts, separated here by a comma and a conjunction. And that's almost all the Proverbs in Solomon's Proverbs are like that. And you can see how this is also combining practicality and faith matters. Then that bit in the middle of Solomon's Proverbs is the sayings of the wise. This is a little bit different from Solomon's Proverbs, not in content, but in its literary type. So it's not these two-part aphorisms. And there's parts of this that actually have a very close relationship with an Egyptian text called the Instruction of Amenhotep or something. And an example of that is an example of this section, and I think this is also in the Egyptian text, although in Egyptian, not in Hebrew, is this proverb: a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. That was one of my favourite proverbs to tell my daughter. So hopefully I didn't scar her too badly with that. And then the next section, there's three bits at the end, three short sections. The sayings of Agur, which is chapter 30, then Lemuel, the sayings of Lemuel, which is the first part of 31, and a poem about a virtuous woman, which is the second part of chapter 31. These come from non-Israelite sources. And Agur's wisdom starts out quite skeptical, and he seems confused and challenged by reality, and his confusion's answered by this appeal to divine revelation in verse 5 here, where it says, every word of God proves true. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. Some people wonder if this do not add to his words, which might remind you of the end of Revelation, if this is the beginning of a Hebrew idea of a canon of scripture, but nobody knows for sure. And it's interesting because the last part of Proverbs is this poem of a virtuous woman. The Hebrew Bible places Ruth and Song of Songs directly after Proverbs. So you get, reading through in order, you get these three contiguous examples of these faithful women who are not merely dependent on men. They have some sort of agency of their own. And so they're wonderful examples for Israelite women. And they're all there, one after another. Our Bible doesn't order things in the same way, so you don't get quite the same effect. Now, it's important to understand the theology of Proverbs. The introduction, those first 9 chapters, actually gives you a hermeneutic, a way to interpret the rest of the book. And so chapter 9, which is the climax of that section, has this duel between wisdom and folly, lady wisdom and this prostitute folly. Wisdom lives at the highest point in the city. The person who lives at the highest point in a city is the God of that city. So wisdom is Yahweh. Yahweh and wisdom are intricately linked in Proverbs' conception of the world. And yet folly also lives at the highest point in the city. So folly also is a god, but obviously not Yahweh. So folly is the false gods, the idols, the gods of the surrounding nations, which Israel has always battled with and struggled with. And both are fighting for worship. In the illustration, they're calling out for companionship, and folly is calling for, she's prostitute, so you can figure out what she's calling for. But it's talking about worship. So Proverbs are actually a battle between God and the powers of Satan for the human heart and mind. And so they're not just talking about living well, they're talking about life and death matters. But it's not a book of laws. Proverb is not a book of laws. Let's have a look at some Proverbs to see how they work. So the first proverb of Solomon, it says it's the Proverbs of Solomon. And the first proverb is, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. When you understand what wisdom and foolishness is, wisdom is obedience to God, folly is idolatry. What makes you gladder as a father than your son following in your faith? And what makes you more miserable as a mum than your son abandoning the faith? And so you can see these very powerful themes through all of the Proverbs, and it gives the Proverbs a greater depth and resonance. In a couple of Proverbs later, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Now, this proverb, you can see that this is not a rule of nature. The righteous do go hungry sometimes, but this is talking about the way that God has designed the world, the way that the world is supposed to be. And so it's talking about the grain of the world, the way that the world is striving to be, is straining to be, but not necessarily the way that it always is. And it's talking about how you can go with the grain of the world when you obey God. And finally, in Proverbs 26, this famous pair of Proverbs, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. They seem to be contradictory, and they are suggesting to contrasting paths. And so wisdom is in knowing which one to apply. So wisdom is not simply having this knowledge, but knowing how to apply it. And seeing that, yes, there are times that you should answer a fool and there are times that you shouldn't. So Proverbs requires quite a sophisticated reading, and I believe that you can't apply Proverbs without the Holy Spirit. This is just an example of lots that have been dug up when you cast lots, like we may throw the dice or the lot, but the Lord determines how they fall. That's what they were. They were, knuckles from sheep and goats, and that's a pot of them from that period. So Song of Songs. This is historically, it's the book of erotic love stories between a man and a woman, and it's traditionally interpreted as the love between God and Israel, or Christ and the church. But is that really what it's about? Is it a drama, or is it a selection of poems? It's interesting to note that when you read Proverbs, it has these he said, she said, the daughters or the women said. Those attributions were added fairly recently, and we first find them in the Codex Sinaiticus from 400 AD. So they're not part of the original text. And the problem with the drama approach is that it's hard to actually understand what the plot and who the characters are, and different people come up with different ideas, which tends to indicate that it was poorly written, or that's not what it's supposed to be like. So the other approach is that it's a bunch of poems about the love between men and women. And that would explain its thematic unity and also the fact that it's hard to discern any plot and character in there. So that's an approach that's become much more popular recently. But we do need to understand why the allegorical approach, the allegorical interpretation, understanding it as about God's love, why was that popular? Well, the reason for that is because both Greeks and Christians were influenced by Hebrews and Christians were influenced by Greek thought, which viewed the physical as sinful. And Song of Songs is all about the physical. It's about the physical love between men and women. So you had to fit it into the Bible, a spiritual book, you had to sort of make it about some spiritual topic. But it's hard to understand how it works that way. When you really read it, it doesn't read that way. And so modern interpreters don't understand it that way. So what's it in the Bible for at all then? Well, it exalts this physical love between a man and a woman in the context of marriage, which is the foundation of all society. So for Israel, that's really important. That's the foundation of the nation of Israel. Israel can't survive without families. But even for Christians, it's really important because Paul makes an analogy between, Paul points out that marriage is a representation of the relationship between Christ and the church. But if we degrade or demean marriage, then that's degrading that relationship between Christ and the church as well. If we exalt marriage and exalt the relationship of marriage, we're exalting also the love of Christ for the church. And so for Christians, the Song of Songs, by exalting this love between men and women, it exalts the love of Christ for the church. So for us, it's a beautiful book that points to both the beauty of human sexual love in marriage and to to what it points to, the love of Christ for the church. And finally, Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, this is a complicated book, so all I can do is give you an introduction to it. It's written by, it's got a complex structure. The traditional view is that this guy called Kohelet was Solomon, and it was written by him, and it's his reflections on his apostasy, which he's now sort of repented from. The critical view from the 19th century, from people who don't think that the Bible's true, is that it's a very late work that's influenced by surrounding cultures, and it's just a religious teaching tool for the Pharisees and people like that. And the conservative view, the view that evangelical Christians have moved towards, is that it's written it's written fairly late, like post-exilic, and it's got a narrator who frames the whole work. So that's written in the third person, the very beginning and the very end. And the rest of it uses the voice of Kohelet to reflect on worldly wisdom. There are benefits to the conservative view that make me lean towards it. Kohelet, by the way, doesn't mean teacher, although it's often translated that way. It actually means assembler, somebody who calls an assembly. They could have called it to teach. So that's why people have interpreted it as teacher, because it seems like he's teaching, but it doesn't literally mean that. So this is its structure. There's 11 verses at the beginning that introduce it in the third person. Then there's this autobiographical section by Kohelet, which is written in the first person, except for a verse in the middle. And then there's this epilogue in the third person. And the introduction and the epilogue emphasize faithfulness to God's word very straightforwardly, whereas the monologue in the middle is this rambling sort of monologue that emphasizes vanity or futility or a mirage, puff of theirs, puff of smoke. And it sort of goes in circles, which is ironic because that's his view of history, that it goes in circles. You know, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything just repeats. Same old, same old. And it contradicts itself. For example, in verse 321, the human soul goes, who knows where? Maybe down to the ground, maybe up to God. Whereas in chapter 12, verse 7, he's confident that it does go up to God. So it's full of beauty and insight, but it's also full of cynicism and skepticism and confusion.
So we actually studied Ecclesiastes last year in A1D, and I picked it up with, oh my God. I read the first 2 verses and I was depressed. But once you've actually got into it, it's actually really good.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful. I love Ecclesiastes. So in a way, it's similar in structure to Job, which we might mention next week, depending. And but the epilogue either condemns the wisdom of Kohelet and things like it, or it recognizes the limit of Kohelet's wisdom, which is merely under the sun, so worldly wisdom. So in either way, the epilogue basically casts Kohelet's wisdom as not sufficient in some way. And so I think that Ecclesiastes, I think a good way of understanding Ecclesiastes is that it's what's called a steel man, which is the opposite of a straw man. It's like the best case example of worldly wisdom. So here's the best example of worldly wisdom. Here's the best that it can do. Look at how it fails. What's better? Obey God. Do what he says. You know, that's better. That's how to live. And so that's what Ecclesiastes is teaching. And even if Kohelet isn't Solomon, which it seems he isn't because the historic context doesn't really match, he's very similar to him, and it helps us understand what happens to Solomon, which we're going to talk about next week, because Solomon doesn't stay as great as he starts. So how do we use these wisdom books? I think that the wisdom books and the story of Solomon help us to recognize that the relationship with God is foundational to right living. You can't live well if you don't have a relationship with God. And as Christians, we can ponder the patterns of Proverbs and Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes and gain from the insight that they provide to the world. But we should always hold those concepts and ideas and patterns to account against Jesus' wisdom, which is the ultimate wisdom because he's the Word of God, and also to the greater insight that the apostles had through the Spirit. So I think that's how we can really benefit from these wisdom books. And they're beautiful books that are well worth reading and rereading and rereading. Now, in terms of resources, Longman Trempe is really good in this area. He's sort of specialised in the wisdom books, and here's a couple of his books that are very different. One is a commentary on Song of Songs from the New International Commentary of the Old Testament, and he takes that love poems approach to Song of Songs. The other one is sort of like a Bible study style book called How to Read Proverbs, about Proverbs. And also I can strongly recommend, although it's a bit of a quick overview, but hey, that's what I've just done. The Bible Project's Wisdom series, which addresses actually Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. It doesn't touch on Song of Songs yet. They haven't got a Song of Songs video yet. Maybe they're trying to figure out how to make it G-rated. So There you go.
Well, thank you, Malcolm, for introducing us to the wisdom literature tonight, and Solomon, the wisest man who ever was, except for Jesus. All right. Any thoughts, comments, questions?